So let's come back to a specific case study, case analysis of electricity deregulation and electricity market restructuring. The example we have is the California electricity deregulation. I'm not sure if you've heard of the California electricity crisis, but what we call the California electricity crisis at some point actually was somewhat of a consequence. Of course, it's a consequence of a lot of unfortunate things happening at the same time. But the fact that the electricity deregulation plan wasn't kind of careful enough, or the regulators hadn't predicted what kind of evil things the market could do, as part of the reason. So California is a big electricity market, and has traditionally it had three utilities. PG and ESEC. I don't know. They pretty much operate different parts of California. I think PG and E is like Pacific, more coastal areas. To this Southern California, San Diego. I don't know. That they operate in different part of California. So the motivation for deregulation is that the power prices have always been high, twice of the average of the U.S. Obviously, it's a combination of different reasons, but people believe that if we improve the efficiency of the system, it might reduce the cost of energy production and energy use. So the California Public Utility Commission proposes reforms, and the new institutions of the market. So basically, the three main utilities, when they merge into the whole market. Two new market institutions are created. One is what we call the California Power Exchange. So you can imagine this is like an exchange where all the generators entering the California market could trade their electricity at. It's a day-ahead market. So day-ahead market means that I'm selling future contracts in a day. So today I'm selling you the contract of electricity production tomorrow. You're paying me this amount of money today. I will deliver electricity to you tomorrow. The reason that we have the prevalence of future market of future contracts in electricity is because the users of electricity wanted to make sure that the uncertainty of the risk is lower. When I want to use electricity, I would like to know what the price is actually at, right? Instead of when I'm using the market, when I'm using electricity, I go to market realizing the price is too high. So the future market, to some extent, helps to reduce the risk associated with electricity market, and then it helps both producers and users to plan ahead of time, right? Imagine if I know what the electricity price I could get tomorrow, I can decide whether or not I want to have my most energy-intensive operations on tomorrow. And for suppliers, if I know how much the electricity I produce tomorrow, what the prices I can sell for tomorrow's production, I'm able to have time to ramp up my production. At this moment, suppose it takes you several hours to warm up your spare generating units, or it takes a few hours for you to adjust the settings of ramping up new production. If I know the price tomorrow, I can plan ahead today about opening up new generating units. That's why we rely a lot on future markets to reduce these contemporaneous mismatch of supply and demand. Imagine there's a sudden demand, and as a supplier, it just takes several hours, even several minutes for you to turn on a new spare generating unit. It kind of creates huge uncertainty. But imagine both of you know about this sudden demand tomorrow. You can plan ahead as a supplier which time should you have all your machines on. So that's the reason why we want the future market to play its role as much as possible. But to deal with the fact that there are just unexpected needs, there are unexpected supply shock as well. So all of a sudden, your generator just go offline. How would the market sort things out itself? There's also what we call independent system operators, so that manage the transmission facilities, and it runs a real-time spot market. So a spot market is a term that usually runs contrary to a future market. So future market is a market where you're trying to sell future rights to certain things. Spot market is a typical market of I give you the money on one hand, you hand the goods over to me at the same time. So that's a spot market. So as a generator, you could choose to sell into the power exchange, the power exchange market, which pretty much operates on future contracts, or you could sell your electricity to the ISO operated real-time spot market. So these are the pre and post restructuring sectors for generation. Pre-structuring, pre-reform, what we had are utility on plants, utility purchases. So all the plants were operated by one of these three utilities. and they don't need to worry about, as a generator, you don't need to worry about who are you going to sell your electricity to, because you're obviously always selling to your owner. Selling electricity from one pocket to another pocket. After the restructuring, these three utilities are allowed to retain some of their operations, such as the nuclear and renewable plants, but they are also allowed to sell some of their generators to the outside owners, such as all these big energy company of the US. Now what they can do is they're buying plants from the three utilities of California, and after you bought some independent plants, you can take your plant and join the market and figure out when and where should I sell my electricity to. Right, the transmission originally are owned separately by these three utilities. Now they get merged together to form one ISO. The utilities are still in charge of the distribution and retailing, because obviously as a California resident, you're always receiving bills from one of these three companies. The reform was that it tried to keep the consumer side less affected. They want all the actions to happen in generation and transmission to improve the efficiency in that world without affecting the consumers that much. So one potential feature of this reform is that the consumer prices are somewhat freezed. There's a price gap. The price can't be higher than price gap. So if you are the ISO buys electricity from generators and sell them to the consumers. So if as an ISO, if the input prices are too high, you might just suffer a loss at the end of the day, because you can't sell the electricity at the same high price to consumers. The consumer prices were freezed to some extent to try to isolate the shock, the uncertainties, whatever could happen to these restructuring on the consumers. Because obviously a consumer, if the loss happened at the ISO side, the government could deal with the mass much better than when the loss or when the shock happened at the consumer side. Imagine, like, as a typical California resident, your electricity bill just exploded at some day. That's going to be a much bigger mess than if you realize this as an ISO owner, as the ISO owner. So that's the idea of isolating the consumer part of the story. What's your judgment about this plan?
Wow, looking at the graphic and to the page 44, I don't know. I had the feeling, if I understand properly, that this plan had some resistance to be applied. I mean, not in California, but I mean because it's similar to the restrictions. I mean, we make the transmission, we nationalize the transmission, and we make some competition in the generation level and distribution level. So it's similar to what we were discussing before.
Okay, so you see there will be resistance at
to the change, because the company, I mean, are losing their safety zone and they have to compete.
Yes. So if you're these three utilities, you will feel somewhat unhappy about this, right? You will realize you need to make big changes. I think they kind of introduced this policy at the moment where these utilities were not doing great, and where the resistance was minimal. So what happened as a result? This was what happened. So after the introduction of after the restructuring of the market, you can see the crazy things happening in California. The price pretty much skyrocketed from $50 per megawatt hour to 400, which is crazy. And there aren't similar. So if you compare these to other markets, they're fine. They're pretty much stable. But it was just the restructured California market just went out of control. So remember, these prices are wholesaling prices. So these are prices coming out from the either power exchange or ISO markets. They're not prices faced by consumers. Consumers were isolated from this shock. So the loss pretty much falls on the ISO or power exchange. So what's your take on this? What kind of factors do you think? What sort of things do you think would go wrong in this process to cause this great? So imagine pretty much the ISO will just go out of business. It's just imagine you're just buying electricity at 400 megawatt hour per megawatt hour and selling it at 100 to your customers. They could easily go broke, and pretty much the Californian government has to step in to bail them out. So what kind of things do you expect to go wrong in this process?
Were there some issues with the generators? Maybe they weren't able to supply enough or something like that? Or yeah, like you mentioned earlier, maybe some of them broke down?
Yes. So as I said, was some of a combination of various failures that get magnified in this market competition. It was summer of 2000. A number of shocks occurred. The weather was slightly hotter than expected. Transmission lines were overheated. there was some hydropower shortages, natural gas shortages. Unfortunately, California introduced some environmental policy at that moment that pushed up electricity prices. There were demand growth from just as a result of the hot weather, because of overheated transmission lines. It was a little bit more difficult to transmit electricity from the generators to the demand side. But even if you combine all these together, you have maybe a 10% growth in demand and 10% decline in supply as an external forces. How could that add up to an 8-fold growth in price is another question, right? So you have some unusual positive demand shock and slightly unusual negative demand shock. The price might just go up by a little bit to rebalance the supply and demand. Obviously, this is a different issue here. So basically, what happened was that imagine there are two markets, the power exchange and ISO. So which market do you expect the prices to be more volatile?
The spot market, because we are expecting that the future market was defined in advance.
Yes.
So the price in the spot will be, steep increase.
Yes, indeed. So ISO, the prices are just going to be more volatile in the spot market than the future market. In the future market, people have this buffer time to adjust their demand and supply behavior. But the ISO market, you're selling at the spot market right now. So the prices are just more volatile. The price in the ISO just shoots up immediately. And actually, generators that were originally selling to the power exchange, follow their traditional future contract to realize that there might be some extra profits to be earned in the spot market. They just enter into the spot market. So as a California operator, regulator, you would want the PX, the power exchange future market, to take 90% of the transaction and have the spot market fill in 10% of the rest of the transaction. That's the optimal plan, but it reverses itself when the prices in the spot market happen to be high for a short period of time. And in addition, there is now clear evidence that firms like energy company like Enron were manipulating the sales of electricity. The spot prices are high, so the better thing would be that the low-cost suppliers will enter into these markets as quickly as possible, so that the prices will drop and everything goes into business. But now it's pretty much some companies would want to manipulate the prices, would want to keep the prices high. ERC said a soft price cap meaning that prices cannot go up more than 150 for a short period of time. Firms try to avoid the price cap by selling to nearby states, which leads to blackouts that affecting hundreds and thousands of customers, and the huge losses accumulated for independent system operators. So sometimes the independent system operators are the original utilities. So PG&E went into bankruptcy after these whole crises. So as a short presentation of what happened when we have a spot market, when the majority of electricity transactions occur in the spot market. So a spot market is a market where both the supply and demand are inelastic. You have inelastic demand and inelastic supply. Right? It's hard to adjust either of the demand or either of the supply within a short period of time when you see the price changes. Price elasticity of demand and supply is when you see a price changes, how much more you can bring to the market as a supplier when price increases, and how much more you can cut your demand off when you see the price rise. Right? In the electricity spot market, neither of these curves are elastic. Imagine if you see price grow by 50%, you will be happy to kind of open another spare generating units if you can, but it takes time for you to do so, right? That's a supply side elasticity. But demand side elasticity, you have all your industrial processes going on, can't just shut them down immediately, even if you know the electricity prices have been high. And also these additional policy feature of freezing the retail rates shut down the demand responses pretty much completely, right? So even if the prices are very high, consumers are not cutting their use of electricity as much as a functioning market would ask them to do. So inelastic demand and supply means that when you have a short movement in the demand curve, you could have a huge movement in the prices, right? So originally they might intersect here, and 8% growth in demand would just mean if everything happened in the spot market, then 8% increase in demand would be sufficient to push price much higher. And if market participants realize that these huge movement, this volatile movement of prices are a good opportunity for arbitrage and a good opportunity for making profits out of other people's inattention, it ended up as a disaster. So the lessons, the spot markets work badly when supplies are tight, should only be considered as a supplement. Regulations need to be in place to limit the use of spot market in this kind of electricity restructuring network. The second advice would be a little bit more controversial. Consumers should be allowed to face wholesale prices to some extent, because obviously take this event as an example. If the consumers are able to adjust their demand as much as possible in face of higher wholesaling prices, maybe the price movement will be smaller. Like imagine in this scenario, if the demand just shifts back, it will make things much better. But on the other hand, these 8-fold increase in wholesaling electricity price, if the full force of these 8-fold growth gets transmitted into the consumer side, get transmitted into the consumer end use of electricity, like imagine what an additional mass it's going to create. It makes some farms might just find them making huge losses if they're industrial users. They would just choose to shut down because their benefits, their profit, their revenue cannot cover the cost of electricity by themselves. There'll be interlocking transmission effects to other sectors as well. So as think about the economy as a whole, maybe you want to avoid this scenario. Also, it's politically a disaster. Like I think after the whole events, the California governor had to resign, or he didn't get reelected after this crisis, and that's when Arnold Schwarzenegger, the movie star, became California governor. So he stepped in after the whole California electricity crisis. Suppliers should be encouraged to sign long-term contracts. The more we know about what future demand and supply are as a market operator, also as market participants, the better. Real-time pricing of retail electricity, if we could allow demand side to respond to electricity price much more flexibly, we could have more elastic demand and supply curve, which solve this problem. Spare capacity, maybe it's about public good. Maybe as a regulator, you want to put aside some spare capacity, which is basically under control of the public sector, under control of ISO or the government instead of ANRO. So ANRO wouldn't do things out of public goods. But if these additional spare units are owned by the government when prices are too high, they should ramp up the production as much as possible to stabilize the price. So that's another lesson to be learned when you're managing special commodities such as electricity. All right, so I covered this example first as a case study of how difficult it is to deregulate natural monopoly sector. And I know electricity is special, but also it involves a lot of things, and how basically policy design could go wrong pretty easily out of things that haven't been well expected, out of specific shocks that haven't been expected by the policy designers. So that's one example.
I have one question.
Sure, go ahead.
About how can we make the demand more elastic? I didn't get so easy because the plants, the users usually energy cannot be changed so much of the need for energy. I mean, if we need to supply goods, we need to make work with plants. So what do you mean by making the demand more elastic? I
think making the demand more elastic, there are technical solutions. Electricity storage is costly, but it's possible. Like there are ways to store energy. So if it's basically it's the same point of making customers exposed to facing the wholesale prices. So one idea is when the electricity prices are high, you try to cut down all your unnecessary operations, like washing machines. And if you have storage capacity, you should ramp up your storage capacity during hours when electricity prices are low. Right? There are all sorts of ways where the demand side could respond to prices by adopting some innovations. But the thing is, they need to have an incentive to do that in the first place. Okay, so energy storage devices and behavior from the customer side to allow a bit more of elasticity in the demand itself. Yes. Thanks.
I want to answer the Emma's question. Like the Chinese government is just promoting the adoption of the smart electric meters in the households. Like we collect the data from the households meters and know their consumption behaviors, and so we can adjust the industrial and households electricity consumption by adjusting the electricity prices accordingly, and to affect their electricity consumption behaviors.
Yes. Smart. Sometimes we have this concept of smart grid, smart metering. Smart grid is basically a grid that tells you when you should use more electricity, when you should use less of the electricity. So imagine you add you add, I don't know how you do this in reality, but what you could do is you pre-program all your household appliances. So this is something that I need to use at this hour. This is a more flexible use of electricity. Washing machine. You can pre-program your washing machine in a way that it automatically turns on, or it send a text to you saying that electricity price is pretty low at this moment. Go back home and turn on your washing machine, something like that. There could be energy storage at your home as well. Try to store energy when electricity price is low. And the command of storing actual energy or turning on washing machine hopefully should be coming from the smart grid itself. You don't need to participate. You don't need to be bothered. You just realize that installing this thing will end up with a lower electricity bill, holding constant the total electricity use. That sometimes we call it smart grid, smart metering, demand management. When you read these things, they point to the same concept of making demand side more flexible, more elastic to changes in prices. It gained traction with higher penetration of renewable energy, because obviously renewable energy supply plan is more volatile. Just during some hours, you just don't have wind, you don't have a sun. When you have a lot of wind, the prices could be pushed down very quickly. When you don't have a lot of, compared to when you have more stable and predictable means of electricity generation, such as fossil fuels. Let's end this session with a video I found online about Enron. I don't know if you've heard of the company Enron. So the company, after a few years, after I think 2005, after the California electricity crisis, the company was found of cooking their books, financial fraud, and we went bankruptcy. But before that, it had done a lot, contributing its own share in the California electricity crisis. So it pretty much means that as a policymaker, you don't want to underestimate the private market participants. They could figure out all the ways to identify loopholes in your system and exploit that. So this is a movie called Smartest Guy in the Room. It's a documentary on Enron, and you could. This is the specific part of that movie about the California electricity crisis. Let's just take a look before we enter into our next session.
Clues to Enron's new strategy: hit California with a joke. It's story of news rolling across the state: Sacramento, San Francisco, Beverly Hills, Long Beach, San Diego. 26,000 miles of California power lines, enough to circle the earth. But for the second day in a row, not enough electricity for America's largest state and the world's 6th largest economy. California's deregulated system was a bizarre compromise between legislators and free market advocates. The rules were complicated and hard to follow. Inside Enron, California's system was little more than a joke. And once in place, Enron made sure that the joke would be on California. I remember the conversation I had with Tim. At the end of it, he said, well, they won't believe anything he said. It didn't matter. It really does. What kooky rules in California was put in place. I got a bunch of really smart people down here who figured out how to make money anyway. One of the smartest guys at Enron was Tim Belton, who ran the West Coast trading desk.
Tim Belton was a fervent believer in the idea of free markets, and as such, he spent hours poring over the new rules for the deregulation of California's energy industry, looking for loopholes that Enron could exploit to make money.
He found plenty. After the bankruptcy, a confidential memo surfaced revealing the names of Belton's strategies to gain the California market. Real Apple, Get Shorty, and Fat Boy. Recently, audio tapes of the Enron traders were discovered. The tapes revealed Enron's contempt for any values except one: making money.
An arbitrage opportunity has been defined as any opportunity to make abnormal profit. So an abnormal profit would be returns above and beyond the norm. I was told that a good trader is a creative trader, and a creative trader is a trader that can find arbitrage opportunities.
One of those opportunities was called Ricochet. In the midst of the energy shortages, Enron traders started to export power out of the state. When prices soared, they brought it back in.
Traders would stay after a 12-hour shift and pour over maps of Western energy grid. What are the permutations and combinations of ways to move power around the West? And I think that's something that Enron knew better than any other energy marketer in the country, period.
We know all the California airports, all the California roads. They're getting pretty small.
These are two traders, TRADERS. This is what they say. What we did was overbook the transmission line we had the rights on and said to California utilities, if you want to use the line, pay us. By the time they agreed to meet our price, rolling blackouts had already hit California, and the price for electricity went through the roof. Did you have any knowledge that this was happening?
The only thing that I'm aware of, Senators, there was a difference of opinion on the rules of the independent system operator. It was just set up. The rules weren't quite clear.
We have traders here for Enron who are saying they did something wrong, but you don't see anything wrong. I have one last question, then I'm done.
Traders soon discovered that by shutting down power plants, they could create artificial shortages that would push prices even higher.
Hey guys, David at Enron. There's not much demand for power on. If we shut it down, can you bring it back up in 3 or 4 hours? Oh yeah. Why don't you go and shut it down then? That's okay. What you guys do is diligate, okay, and come up with a go down. Like force down effectively. Right.
Those guys have it. California are hitting higher than 100 degrees, fueling wildfires and fears that California's strained power grid could once again near collapse.
Well, definitely. It's a fire and collapse. It's doing 10,000 to 100. Burn, baby, burn. That's a beautiful thing.
I was never comfortable on the trading floor at Econ, and if I had questions, I didn't ask them because I didn't want to know the answer. I didn't want to confirm what I suspected might be true. That what I was doing was in fact unseemly, or was at least unethical, if not worse.
Why did the traders do what they did? Was it their multi-million-dollar bonuses, or had Enron found a way to exploit the darker side of human behavior?
So obviously, the video has one view. It tends to blame the wicked capitalists from exploiting the loopholes in the system. On the other hand, as a policymaker, you need to be aware of these scenarios, and you need to be more sensitive to you want to kind of introduce more robust measures if someone happened to step in and exploit the system, right? So let's move on to, I think the plan is we leave 15 minutes in the end to discuss about your projects. And before that, there are 2 sample questions. You see my slides? So suppose the electricity market for new territory is dominated by a monopolist. It faces market demand and the total cost function. So for the marginal revenue and marginal cost functions of the monopoly first, and find the profit maximizing price and quantity. So it's just an exercise about working out monopolist problem. It's pretty standard. Right? Work on it yourself. I will give you maybe 5 minutes for the first 2 questions. Figure out the marginal revenue marginal cost curve and figure out the price and quantity set by the monopolists. Okay, I think in terms of marginal revenue and marginal cost curve, it's always easier to come up with the marginal cost curve, right? Marginal cost curve is just derivative of a total cost function as a function of Q, right? If you take the derivative, I think it's obviously the marginal cost curve is Q. Marginal revenue function is going to be 40 minus Q times Q. You just revenue is a function of price times quantity. So it's going to be 40 minus Q times Q, which is 40 Q minus Q square. So marginal revenue function is just going to be the derivative of revenue function as a function of Q, which eventually is 40 minus 2Q, I believe. So find the profit maximizing quantity and price. So what would be the profit maximizing price? So what profit maximization means for a monopolist? Profit maximization means MC equals to MR, right? which essentially is P is going to be whatever 14 minus 2. I will not go through P itself. What's the socially optimal price and quantity? How would the social planner charge? So imagine you are the government that nationalizes this company. What price you're going to set? That's the social optimal prices. So I'm asking you for social optimal price and asking you for government regulated prices. They in this specific setting, they're the same prices, right? We know that social optimality means that price is equal to marginal cost, right? Which eventually means that 14 minus Q is equal to marginal cost, which is Q. So Q is 20, right? As you can see, 20 is larger than, you need to check these numbers, whether or not they make sense.
26.6.
Question?
26.6 should be, if I did.
Yeah, 26, do you mean here?
Yeah, the price of the profit maximization.
Okay, fine. Whatever the 26 minus. This should be looking along those lines, right? So obviously the quantity set at the social optimum is going to be higher than the quantity in the monopolist problem. That's a typical inefficiency coming from monopoly. The monopoly chooses to sell too high, and then less amount of goods are delivered to the market. So the price is obviously, you should expect the price to be lower than 26.667, right? It's 20. Just check how these costs and the price and quantity correspond. At the regulated price, so for the profit or loss for the monopolist, so when the profit is a negative one, it's what we call a loss. So your intuition would tell you that the company is likely to suffer from a loss at a regulated price, because obviously if you look at the total cost function, it comes with a fixed cost of 10. So that's a sign that there might be economic of scale. We could solve for that. At the regulated price, the profit is going to be revenue minus total cost. Revenue is just P times Q minus 10 minus you know that P and Q are 20, each of them are 20. It's 400 minus 10 minus so it's going to be 120, right? And we can solve for the monopolist price and quantity. Hopefully it should be something higher than the regulated profits. So why is that? So here obviously there is a fixed cost, but eventually the firm is able to make a profit at the regulated. It's at the regulated price. So what's your intuition on that? So what makes the firm able to make a positive profit? Remember, when we were talking about the natural regulation of natural monopolies, the issue is that whenever we set price equal to marginal cost, these firms cannot cover its fixed cost. The issue here is the firm actually it doesn't have constant marginal cost. Its marginal cost is actually variable. Marginal cost is low at the beginning and gets higher over time. And when we're setting price equal to the marginal cost, we're setting price equal to the marginal cost at the market equilibrium point. But before the market equilibrium point, all the previous units of goods brought to the market are produced when the marginal cost is lower than price. Right? So it's not a typical natural monopolist problem, because a natural monopoly would require you to have an ever downward sloping average cost curve. But in this case, the average cost curve, average cost would be k minus q plus a half times q. Right? It's going to decrease for a while and increase back. It's not going to be ever decreasing. So it's not the classical natural monopoly case. Discuss 3 types of policy responses to monopoly. Obviously, you have the antitrust area where you break up monopolists, you introduce competition. You could have the government take over. You could have the public setting of prices in this monopolist market. Or you could raise doing nothing as a response to monopoly, saying that there are reasons we don't want to regulate the monopolist because of other reasons. Because the desire to motivate firms to put down R&D expenses, right? So that's a monopolist problem. It's pretty standard monopolist problem. You're going to face different demand function, different cost function. You're asked to solve for market equilibrium versus optimality conditions and figure out what are the actions of policy interventions. Another question, travel cost method. In order to determine the demand curve for a park, you have decided to survey visitors to the park. Individuals come from different zones, and you ask individuals to provide you with the zone that they're coming from. You have information of the total population in different zones. So for different zones, the travel cost increases as you move further away. And as you move further away, the number of visitors drop. Right? That's a typical demand function. Using the travel cost method, calculate the equation relating travel cost to the number of visitors. So the idea is for you to draw a scatter plot of visitors at the y-axis and travel cost at the x-axis, or vice versa. It's fine. Just draw the demand function. And I think if you can try this yourself, you will realize it's going to be a linear curve. How would this linear curve? I think slope is like 500 demands. Suppose T is the travel cost. Q is going to be there's a linear relationship between number of visits and the travel cost. Right, the second question would be just draw the demand schedule, calculate the daily consumer surplus. How would you calculate the consumer surplus when you have a demand schedule? You just figure out the size of the area of the triangle, right, below demand schedule, below the demand curve. Suppose the park authority decides to charge admission to raise revenue. What would be the optimal price set? So this is actually a monopolist problem, right? Here the issue is that you know the demand curve, the marginal cost is 0. So suppose like you own this park, you're opening this park up to the public, and you're charging fees for that. It's equivalent to the question where you face, as a monopolist, you face the market with a demand function like that. And the admission fee would be, so how would admission fee X would enter into this demand function as something here, right? It actually adds to the travel cost, right? So imagine originally the travel cost is 0 when you charge an admission fee. The travel cost of 5, the travel cost will become 5, and it reduces the visit from 2,500 to 0. So somewhat the marginal revenue is going to be, I think the revenue is going to be something like that. And you can work out marginal revenue. The marginal cost is 0, which is the marginal cost of allowing people in is 0. So you just set marginal revenue equals to 0 to figure out what the admission fee, what the optimal, not optimal, profit maximizing admission fee should be. If visitors to the park also stop by other destinations nearby, how would it affect your questions to be? Obviously, if one deficiency of the travel cost method is that we can't deal with multi-purpose trip very well. So if we find that one specific travel cost is associated with multiple sites, the consumer surplus tend to be overestimated because we're mistaking the consumer benefits of other sites to the specific sites we're talking about. So I think it's a good time for a break. Let's have a 7 minutes break and see you in 9:10.